Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would review this little video that I found very particularly interesting. And this is probably going to be the last little bit of a conversation that I'm going to have over this debate, or at least over this conversation. And of course, for those of you that do not know of this conversation, this is over the Vasyl Lomachenko, or more really of the Devin Haney and Jermell Charlo debate, which of course is the debate over why are Devin Haney and Jermell Charlo not on the top 10 pound for pound list of ESPN's top 10 pound for pound list within the boxing scene. And overall, it is somewhat a decently reasonable question because when you talk about Mr. Jermell Charlo and when you talk about Mr. Devin the Dream Haney, both of them are completely undisputed for their divisions, and they are both 2A grade fighters, no doubt about it. Well, one of the fighters that, of course, was recently on the top 10 pound for pound list, not only on ESPN's top 10 pound for pound list, but also on Ring Magazine's top 10 pound for pound list, was Mr. Vasyl Lomachenko. And one of the questions that some of the channels and some of the people asked was, why do you have Vasyl Lomachenko on the list and not Jermell Charlo and Devin Haney? Shouldn't Devin Haney and Jermell Charlo be on the top 10 pound for pound list? Because all in all, when it comes down to it, aren't those fighters at the current moment in time at a better point in their careers because they have all the belts and they're coming off of wins, and either A, they're undefeated, or they avenge their losses, and that is a very decent point. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about, in my view, about at least not only in terms of the pound per pound list, but who in my view would be the better of all these three fighters between Vasyl Lomachenko, Devin Haney, and Jermell Charlo. Now, if we're just talking about from a skill set perspective, do I believe that Vasyl Lomachenko more than likely is probably the most all-around skilled fighter compared to Devin Haney or Jermell Charlo out of the complete three? Yes, I do. But at the current moment in time, Mr. Vasyl Lomachenko, he did lose that last fight against Mr. Teofimo Lopez in his last 50-50 fight. So Lomachenko would not currently be on my top 10 pound for pound list. And this is also going to be me a little bit more commentating on Mr. Jermell Charlo and Devin Haney, and why, if they would be on my top 10 pound for pound list, and Devin Haney, in my view, certainly would be when it comes down to it. But Jermell Charlo, I'm not quite so sure. And some people overall have disagreed with me on that, but it just is what it is. Listen, I'm not going to argue with you on it too much. If you have Jermell Charlo on your top 10 pound for pound list, that's you. I certainly don't have an issue with that. But he would probably just miss my top 10 pound for pound list, but so would Vasyl Lomachenko. But Devin Haney certainly, in my view, not only is he undefeated, but he is the complete undisputed champion. He beat George Kambosos very dominantly, in my opinion, even though George Kambosos was never truly an A-plus champion, but it is what it is. He beat the guy that beat the man in Teofimo Lopez. He beat George Kambosos, in my view, by a very clear at least 9 rounds to 3. So Devin Haney does deserve a great amount of credit. And on top of that, he is very decently skilled, even though his defense, in my opinion, can be a little bit leaky. But at the end of the day, we're going to talk about that in this video. And this is going to be by Mr. BOXINGEGO, a channel and all that I do tend to review here and there, just like Dante's Boxing Nation or some of these other channels. And some of you, once again, some of you who may be new, some of you all in all that may not be new. Once again, you may ask the question, why do you review these channels? And I had a person all in all bring up a conversation or bring up overall, the question. They said, well, don't you believe what Dante's Boxing Nation and BOXINGEGO and some of these other channels do? Don't you believe that what they do is actually a positive because they bring up certain double standards, especially against that of black fighters? Well, don't get me wrong. I think all in all that some of the points that they have may be somewhat correct here and there, but a lot of the points that they also make about other fighters, besides that of black American fighters, especially in my view, they can just be downright ridiculous. And just pretty much like ESPN, just pretty much overall like that of the Ring Magazine or whoever you believe is holding double standards against black fighters. Dante's Boxing Nation and Ego, they're pretty much no better. They're just turned inside out. Because basically, you will hear the most ludicrous things that I've ever personally heard overall about some of the fighters that they end up talking about, like a Canelo Alvarez, like a Tyson Fury, like an Alexander Usyk, like some of these other fighters. So do not think overall for a second that these channels, that they do not have biases. Yes, sometimes they do bring up very, very good points, but there's a certain amount of journalists out there that bring up very good points. the way that I look at it, not everyone is going to be right 100% of the time, or we're not going to agree 100% of the time. But what are your morals? What are your true machinations? What is really overall your true intentions? And a lot of the times, the intentions of a lot of these LDBC and new media channels is no disrespect. It's I'm not trying to badmouth any of these guys, but a lot of the times they do bring up certain double standards that really just make no damn sense. And depending overall on the complexion of the fighter, they will try to tear down certain fighters. And remember, these are the same channels that even went as far to say that Tyson Fury allegedly cheated Deontay Wilder. They basically tried to taint his career and strip him of the title wrongfully by basically having no evidence whatsoever that Tyson Fury, not only were they alleging that he cheated Deontay Wilder, but that he apparently put metal or egg whites in his gloves. So those are the same guys, all in all, that are bringing up these points. Don't get me wrong, not every single point that they bring up, in my opinion, is a bad point. But these guys cannot be trusted as far as I can see them. It just is what it is. Because when you prove to me that overall that you're going to let that racial issue bother you so much to the point to where, and don't get me wrong, it's not a bad thing to stick up for your own whatsoever. That is not the issue. But when you prove to me that you obviously overall have such a racial issue, and that you live through these athletes in such a way to where you really, in certain terms, cannot give a logical and objective analysis. That, in my opinion, is where the problem comes in. And a lot of these channels are not objective. It just is what it is. And I never, within my analyzations, I will never rank things super duper emotionally. We may all talk a little bit emotionally here and there, but within my videos, I always try my best to be the most logical and objective person possible. So anyways, so that is why I tend to review these videos. But anyways, in this conversation, Mr. Boxing Ego, he's going to talk about this conversation. Let's see what he has to say.
Ring Magazine brand new ratings. How on earth is Lomachenko rated number 6 in the lightweight division when you got Devin the Dream Haney undisputed in the lightweight division? That's what I want to talk about in this video. Stay tuned. What up, Fight World? It's your boy Ego, and I'm back with some more boxing. Make sure you come in, smash the like button, SLC, subscribe, like, and comment. Now, I already made a video about this. This is a follow-up video because I got more to say. I'm back. Devin Haney went to Australia, and he fought against George Kambosos. And in doing that, he became undisputed. Ring Magazine belt included. Now, the funny and ironic thing is that despite Devin Haney going to enemy territory, facing the champion in George Kambosos Jr., not only beating him, but defeating him and making it look one-sided somehow, some way.
Well, you know what? Let me state this very, very quickly. And I give Devin Haney a great amount of credit for that. But let's not sit here and act like George Kambosos was someone who was an actual world beater. Now, he did defeat a couple of former champions in Teofimo Lopez, Mickey Bay, and Lee Selby. So obviously he somewhat had the goods. But no one really truly expected Mr. George Kambosos to probably pull off the upset against Teofimo, at least against the Teofimo that was going to, take him seriously. Or I shouldn't say anyone. Excuse me. I shouldn't say, anyone. But when it comes down to it all in all, most people did not expect it. And even Mr. Ego in his past videos will tell you that he believes that Mr. Teofimo Lopez, that he put on a very shitty performance compared to his usual standards. So what is Mr. Ego truly saying? Just like I have said this whole entire time, George Kambosos was never an A-plus caliber fighter. Never was. All he is, in my view, was a better version of a Jeff Horn. All he was, in my view, was another Kelly Pavlik, another Buster Douglas, another Andrew Ruiz. Someone who was a little bit more talented than maybe what most of us thought, certainly than what his competitor thought. When it came down to it, he was overlooked and he was underestimated, and that's the reason why he won that fight. But as soon as he went into that next fight, either in an immediate rematch or against another top contender, not only did he lose, he got completely squashed and dominated. Okay? So that's why I compare him to those fighters. George Kambosos is a decent fighter, don't get me wrong, but he is not a world beater. Devin Haney, in my opinion, does deserve a certain amount of credit. But once again, even Ego will tell you within his past videos, he did not even truly believe that George Kambosos was an A-grade champion. So let's cut the bullshit.
Ring Magazine came up with their brand new pound for pound list, and Devin Haney's not on it in the top 10 all weights.
And once again, this is another reason why I like to review these videos, because depending on the fighter, they will change the narrative according to what fighter it suits for them. That's another reason why I review these videos, because that's not something you're going to see from me on my channel. I don't I don't change the narrative depending overall on what fighters I like or don't like. I try to treat everyone with the same exact energy. And everything that I put out there is always going to be the logical and objective thing from my perspective. But anyway.
To me, this is blasphemous and is highly disrespectful to Devin Haney, because this is the catch-22 that old media puts you in. They'll tell you to do all these different things, you know, go fight in enemy territory, go fight a champion, fight someone who's rated, you know what I mean? Well, actually champions technically don't get rated, but you would you would recognize that person who is a champion, right? Take the short money. Devin Haney did all these things. He even left his longtime promoter Eddie Hearns, left DAZN where she was getting more money, and he took short money to fight George Kambosos. He did all these things and made all these concessions.
I agree, and I give Devin Haney a lot of credit for that. Because he could have been like another Demetrius Bulbo, Andrade, or Jamal Charlo and stated, oh, I can't face anyone else other than this fighter or this or this. Now, Devin Haney was only really given the opportunity against George Kambosos, who had the complete undisputed title. So maybe one would argue, well, maybe we just haven't seen him avoid someone that we think is dangerous enough yet. But I wouldn't make that argument, because Devin Haney did try to get in the ring with Lomachenko. He has called out Gervonta Tank Davis, I believe, and a certain amount of the other fighters there. And all in all, he just hasn't gotten some of them. So I give Devin Haney credit.
And now, when you see him as the undisputed champion in the Ring Magazine champion, and he can't even get recognition from that same entity, it's highly questionable. And it makes you wonder, what do you have to do to be on the top 10 if you can have the Ring Magazine belt? Now, it looks like, to me, the Ring Magazine, they're limiting, and I've said this before, how many black fighters are on the list. You typically see no more than maybe two at a time. Like Jermell Charlo.
Well, that's somewhat understandable, Mr. Ego, and you can make that point if it overall makes sense. But once again, on my personal top 10 pound per pound list, I only have about 3 definitive black fighters on my top 10 pound per pound list. Once again, let's go through the top 10 pound per pound list once again. If we were to talk about the black fighters, let's just talk about the most elite dominant black fighters, no matter where they come from in the world right now. You probably have Devin Haney up there. You have Terrence Crawford. You have Errol Spence Jr. You have Jermell Charlo. Maybe Steven, Cool Boy Fulton or Coolhan, whatever the hell his name is. When it comes down to it, I can't really think of a whole lot of others. Maybe Deontay Wilder, if you wanted to put him up there. Shakur Stevenson, I forgot about him. So those are pretty much the most elite black fighters that you're going to think about in all of boxing today. Jerron Boots Ennis, of course, is a great talent. Gervonta Tank Davis, but they cannot be on my top 10 pound per pound list because they just don't have the resumes. So it just is what it is. So we can sit here and complain about, who is and who is not on the list when it comes down to Ego can complain about there not being enough black fighters on the list. But let's talk about fighters that, are black that truly deserve to be on the list. Once again, I like to break things down logically and objectively. Let's talk about all the black fighters that truly deserve to be on the list. And then let's compare them to some of the other fighters that are out there. When you talk about Terrence Bud Crawford, he is a 3-weight division champion. When it comes down to it, he completely unified 140 pounds. He is one of the most skilled and most dominant fighters on the planet. I think that he pretty much has to be on your top 10 pound per pound list. Errol Spence Jr., his resume speaks for itself, as well as his skill set. But then when you kind of get after that, it gets a little bit murky. Devin Haney, in my opinion, he does deserve to be on the top 10 pound per pound list, but his resume and also his accomplishments can somewhat be comparable to that of other fighters on the list that are not black fighters. If you talk about that of a Jermell Charlo, you certainly could put him on the top 10 pound per pound list. I would not personally, and I know a lot of people would have a grudge with that or a gripe with that, but I would not put him on there personally because I don't think that his resume is quite as good enough, in my opinion, as some of the others So what other black fighters truly deserve to be on the top 10 pound for pound list? Now, the only other one that I can really think of that truly could deserve to be on that top 10 pound for pound list would be Shakur Stevenson. So the black fighters that I really would have on my top 10 pound for pound list would probably be about 4, probably at the max, maybe 5. You could if you wanted to, but I don't really see a lot of these other fighters on the list as being a super huge problem. Because when we talk about Alexander Usyk, you have to put him on the top 10 pound for pound list. He completely unified the cruiserweight division, which was decently talented when he did it. There was a lot of undefeated fighters there, and he was able to completely embarrass them when it came down to it. And then he beat Anthony Joshua. He has to be up there. And in many people's minds right now, he is the current number one pound for pound fighter. In my opinion, the number one pound for pound fighter right now is between 4 fighters. Spence, Crawford, Usyk, and Fury. Canelo, in my opinion, he would still be right out of that conversation, but he did lose his last fight, so I can't have him there at the moment. So it just is what it is. But let's also talk about some other fighters. Naoya Inoue could easily be on that list as well. You can debate that, Naoya Inoue, that he has been the most dominant fighter within the past several years. He's a 3-weight division champion. He won, I believe, the Muhammad Ali trophy, and I believe there maybe was even one division to where he was completely unified. Now, if you wanted to maybe debate that he doesn't belong on there because his resume doesn't stack up as much as some others, that's up to you. In my opinion, he probably would just make it. And then we're having other fighters like overall a Dimitri Bivol or a Josh Taylor or overall that of an Artur Beterbiev. All those fighters that I just mentioned could easily make the top 10 pound for pound list. So, once again, in my opinion, does Devin Haney deserve to make the top 10 pound for pound list? More than likely he does, but we also have to take a look at a lot of the other competitive spots. And the reason why these channels are not to be trusted is because, once again, they're very advocates overall for their black American fighters, which is a great thing. There's no problem with that. But when you're so advocate or so over emotional to the point to where you're not willing to give credit where credit is due, then all of a sudden that becomes a problem. I mean, overall, if I were to take a look at the NFL when it comes down to it, or if someone were to take a look at the NFL, and if someone were to take a look at Patrick Mahomes, who of course is mixed, but of course the majority of the time he's going to be called a black, quarterback when it comes down to it. 90% of the time, the most dominant quarterbacks or the greatest quarterbacks in history of the NFL have been that of Caucasoid or Caucasian quarterbacks. That would overall be like someone saying, well, Patrick Mahomes, the only reason why he's ranked so highly overall, and it's ridiculous that he's ranked as the best in the NFL, but the only reason why that is because he's a black quarterback. No, the reason why Patrick Mahomes on a lot of lists is ranked as the number one quarterback is because within a short amount of time, he has an MVP. He has a multitude of Pro Bowls. He's already made, I believe, 1 or 2 first-team All-Pros. He's already been to 2 Super Bowls, and he's won a Super Bowl and won the Super Bowl MVP. So my point being is this. Is that overall a part of the package depending on whatever sport that you want to be in? Is sometimes race a part of the package? Yes, it is. And even if they are a great fighter, sometimes will they have a little bit of that complexion on their side that puts them in a different level? Yeah, you can certainly debate that. But we have to know the difference between someone that is a complete great white hype and someone that overall actually does deserve to be on a top 10 pound per pound list or deserves to be ranked where they are. We have to truly know what is overrated and what is underrated and what is properly rated. And a lot of people just don't know what that is. And a lot of the times, these guys from the LDBC and new media, no offense to them, but it just is what it is. And not even just them, but a lot of sports fans in general. They cannot be relied upon because they're so over emotional and pro-racial. It just is what it is, especially in boxing. So what they're always going to tell you is that they're always going to have that victim mentality first and, basically forever. So every time that they may not see certain black fighters on the top 10 pound per pound list, they'll immediately overall believe that, something wrong is afoot. And listen, I get it. There is a certain amount of fans out there that may go against certain black athletes or black fighters. Listen, I get it at the end of the day. Just like how DBN and a certain amount of these LDBC and new media boys go against pretty much every other racist fighter. But when it comes down to that, at the end of the day, once again, we have to be logical and objective enough and factual enough to place things in their proper ranking. Okay? So it just is what it is.
Went through the same thing.
And once again, if we place things in their proper ranking, once again, if we talk about black fighters, especially American black fighters, there's really, in my view, only about 4 that could definitively be on the list because the boxing pound for pound list is very, very competitive. You have Josh Taylor, who could be within the bottom five. You also overall have Artur who could be there. Some would put Lomachenko there. I personally would not, at least at the moment, but some would. Shakur Stevenson is there, who, of course, is a black American fighter when it comes down to it. Devin Haney, Jermell Charlo. Those are the black American fighters that maybe would either just make my list or not make my list. But depending on the rankings when it comes down to it. But then you also have Artur Beterbiev when it comes down to it. You also have Dmitry Bivol, who just beat the former undisputed number one pound-for-pound fighter. Does he not have a true debate on the top 10 pound-for-pound list? You see what I'm saying? So once again, we have to be very, very careful with how we rank things.
Where he was undisputed, knocked out Castano. Some people thought he lost the first fight. Some people thought he won the first fight. Some people thought it was a draw. Needless to say, he put all that to bed in the rematch and knocked out Castano, dropping him. I don't even think Castano had been dropped before. And
he did knock him out, but the reason why Jermell Charlo does not make my top 10 pound-for-pound list is because, it's just very simple. And I was having a conversation with a dude that wasn't bringing up the worst points, but my arguments were this. He basically said, well, why, did you diss Jermell Charlo for losing to Tony Harrison when, Vasyl Lomachenko ended up losing to Orlando Salido? And my argument has always been this for that. When Vasyl Lomachenko lost to Orlando Salido, he was just coming into professional boxing. Now, of course, his retort or his point, and a certain amount of other people's points may be, well, he did so much work in the amateurs. Right, but we all know that amateur boxing is not the same as professional boxing. Just like college football is not the same overall as the NFL. Or college, basketball is not the same as the NBA. So you can be the greatest, NBA, player, or excuse me, you can be overall the greatest college player that we've ever seen. Like Pistol Pete Maravich, I believe, back all the way in whatever time that he was playing. I can't necessarily remember. There's many people that would claim that he's the greatest college player of all time. But in the NBA, there's never a debate that he could be the greatest NBA player of all time, even though he was a decently great NBA player. So the amateurs and overall the professionals does have to be looked at as different. Just as Dante's Boxing Nation and a certain amount of these other guys say, Vasyl Lomachenko, when it comes down to it, he cannot be remembered in professional boxing for what he did in the amateurs, and I agree with that. But overall, if you're going to say that, well, Lomachenko, he should be already ready because he had so much experience in the amateurs, well, then wouldn't that be you giving credit to Lomachenko for what he did in the amateurs, kind of for the pros? Because once again, the pros are a lot different than the amateurs. And when Lomachenko started off with boxing, he was immediately thrown to the wolves. He was immediately overall thrown basically to the biggest guys out there. In his second professional fight, he was already fighting a guy in Orlando Salido overall. That was a very tough and rugged veteran, someone who was extraordinarily experienced compared to that of Vasyl Lomachenko in professional boxing. And on top of that, when it came down to it, Lomachenko was only just beginning his career. That was the second fight of his career, and he was already set up for a title shot. So the expectations on Lomachenko's shoulders were vastly different. When Jermell Charlo lost to Tony Harrison, he was looked at as the all-around best champion in that division, or at least very much debatably. At the time, I believe it was either him or Julian J. Rock Williams. But at the time, I believe he was the WBC champion. You were favored to beat Tony Harrison. And Tony Harrison was a guy that never even won a belt in his career. Jermell Charlo had over 30 fights. When Vasyl Lomachenko lost to Orlando Salido, Salido had, I believe, over 30 or 40-something fights on his record. Lomachenko, that was the second professional fight of his career. So I can kind of, I don't want to necessarily say forget it, but I can give you a little bit of a pass. It's almost kind of like if we take a look at Marvin Hagler or Manny Pacquiao in the early part of their career. Yeah, they have a few losses in the earlier part of their career, but that was not necessarily when they were at their peak. We have to take a look at you when you lost pretty much at your best. And Lomachenko was very inexperienced at that point in time in his career in terms of professional boxing. Jermell Charlo was not. Jermell Charlo was looked at as probably the best all-around 154-pounder. Now, one could debate that he's a little bit better now than what he was back then, but it's not by that long of a shot. And not only did you lose to Tony Harrison, someone who never won an official belt in his career, at least one of the official belts in that, division, because Tony Harrison was basically known for getting knocked out in every big fight in his career. He was knocked out 3 previous times before Jermell Charlo lost to him. And then on top of that, you probably should have lost very clearly to Brian Castano, but you ended up getting a little bit of a gift decision draw. And certain people may not like that. That's just my perspective. It is what it is. All right. So that is the reason why Jermell Charlo does not make my top 10 pound for pound list. And a certain amount of people may disagree. But listen, everything that I say is always going to have probably not just one point, but a few.
This is what Jermell Charlo did. He put that exclamation point, right, on the victory. And earlier renditions of the top 10 ratings still didn't put Jermell Charlo on the top 10 pound for pound list. And I'm like, how? And then they just recently added him.
I don't have him on my top 10 pound for pound list either. And isn't it so interesting that when these guys were talking about Canelo, they were talking about how he allegedly lost to Gennady Golovkin. And I do believe that Canelo lost the first Gennady Golovkin fight. But they were talking about how he should have lost to him twice and he should have lost to Lara and, he lost to Mayweather, all this other shit. But all of a sudden, when it comes to Jermell Charlo, one of the boys that they like, one of the fighters that they like, all of a sudden, those controversial decisions are some of the, tricky fights that he had against lesser caliber fighters when it came down to it than that of a Canelo Alvarez. All of a sudden, they just throw that shit out the window. So once again, this is why I review these channels for certain guys that come on my channel. Certain people may say, oh, well, they expose racism in boxing. Well, they do that partially, but they only do it in one side. And a lot of the times, they're also creating narratives for a certain amount of other boxers that, in my view, are more harmful than good. So more oftentimes than not, in my view, these channels are doing way more harm than what they are good or positive.
To the pound for pound list. And now you have the same thing with Devin Haney. It's like they don't want the list to look too melanated or something. Not only did they not add Devin Haney, but they also added Vasyl Lomachenko, which begs even deeper and further.
Well, I would agree with you that Vasyl Lomachenko should not be on the list, but Mr. Ego, you're not really making a point that more black fighters should be on the list other than that of Vasyl Lomachenko, because who else on the list are you really making that good of a point for? You haven't really made that great of a point for Josh Taylor or Dimitri Bivol or even Artur not being on the list, because every single one of those fighters are undefeated and probably have a better resume than some of the other fighters that you would want to put over them, at least debatably.
Questions. How is Lomachenko on the top 10 pound for pound list? Number 6. And he's in his last 3 fights, he lost one of his fights to Teofimo Lopez, lost all his titles. They're showing a picture of Lomachenko in this top 10 holding a Ring Magazine belt as if he still has it, which to me is basically like false advertising. And then you have someone in the same division who has no losses, undefeated, just beat a champion, and he can't get any recognition. I mean, it's disrespectful. Now you see why Devin Haney posted that tweet stating that he doesn't need to bring, or you won't see him with the Ring Magazine belt, to which Ring Magazine responded and said that Devin Haney should mail the belt back to them, which is very unprofessional. Like, even
Well, listen, Devin Haney, when it comes down to it, I don't have a problem with what he stated about shipping the Ring magazine back. I don't really have a problem with that. But at the end of the day, if you're going to say something that, this is bullshit, the Ring magazine don't even have me on the top 10, I might as well just mail this back. You can't be surprised when they come out as an organization and basically say, oh, no, okay, well, then why don't you just ship it back? You can't be surprised at that. So if Devin Haney is going to stick by it, then he should say, okay, no problem, just ship it back and don't worry about it. Because the Ring Magazine belt is not really one of the official belts anyways, so who cares?
no, despite I'm a
And in my opinion, don't get me wrong, it is great to have that because, of course, these athletes are very competitive. But if you believe that the Ring Magazine, that there is some racial issue afoot, then you should not want that belt in the first place.
true speaker. So despite all the BS that the WBC has done,
Well, in my view, Mr. Ego, especially you compared to other new media platforms, there's some of the times, in my opinion, where you do speak the truth or bring up very good points, but there's a lot of the times where you also bring up a bunch of bullshit. It just is what it is. That's why you attack certain fighters overall of a certain complexion, and you protect certain fighters of a certain complexion. And I'm sorry, but I just don't roll with that. It is what it is.
recently, Mauricio Suleiman at least remains professional as he's representing the WBC, and he hasn't, like, even if people have had problems with raising the level.
He says that overall Mauricio Sullivan remained professional. I thought you were the same guy that stated that he was protecting Tyson Fury overall from cheating and all sort of bullshit when it came down to it, and that he was super unprofessional because he was protecting Canelo Alvarez and a lot of these other guys. But of course, I understand what he's saying.
Of Clem Buterol or the franchise champion, he doesn't say stuff like "mail us our belt back." You know, he keeps it professional.
Well, once again, if you're going to state that, basically, if you're going to give a big middle finger to that overall the Ring magazine, you cannot be surprised when their retort basically is, okay, if you don't want to ship it back. It was kind of like almost like the Terrell Owens situation. For those of you that remember, Terrell Owens, it took him a very, very long time to get inducted into the Hall of Fame. Now, that was a little bit of a different process compared to this one. But Terrell Owens, overall, when it came down to it, he basically said he did not want to show up there. So then in the Hall of Fame in return, they said, fine, we don't need you. Or I believe it was something like that. So once again, you cannot be surprised by that retort. I don't have a problem with overall what, I don't have a problem with what Mr. Devin Haney stated. He has the right to believe that he's a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. And some would maybe even say that in their opinion that he probably shouldn't have said that. I don't have a problem with it. But listen, at the end of the day, if you're going to say that, then don't be afraid to ship it back to them. You have to stand by your statement.
So it's rather shocking to see Ring Magazine owned by Golden Boy, and this is how they represent their company. And since Ring is owned by Oscar De La Hoya and Golden Boy, it makes you wonder if Ryan Garcia, who was one of the names that was rumored to possibly fight George Kambosos Jr., if he would have went to Australia and beat George Kambosos Jr. and became undisputed, do you honestly believe that Ring Magazine would vote and not put Ryan Garcia on the top 10 anywhere?
Well, they probably would, but Oscar De La Hoya also promotes Ryan Garcia. So what kind of a question is that? I mean, it is what it is. But of course, if you're also talking about from a racial perspective, I think a better question would be when it comes down to it, if you have someone like let's state all in all, like I'm trying to think of a better situation. Let's say had Devin Haney been a Caucasian fighter, would the results have been different? That would be a better point when it comes down to it. And who knows? It could be. It could be because once again, do I believe that sometimes at Ring Magazine or ESPN that they have, a racial preference? Yes, I do. Just like DBN and Boxing Eagle, they have their racial preferences as well. And that's why, in my view, like I always tell people, I really don't rely on anyone else's pound-for-pound list other than my own.
In the top 10, especially when they have guys like Lomachenko? Like, just think about that. Because that could have been a possibility. And here, like, see, I've been in boxing for a while, so I know how to shut down old media. You have to just, all the excuses they'll come up with, we have to block all the exits, and that's what I fully.
Well, it's very interesting that Mr. Ego calls himself old media, or excuse me, that he calls himself new media. But basically, subconsciously, he must know that really all he is that he's a lot like old media. He's just on the opposite spectrum. Because even he himself will call himself new media. Someone basically stating that he is combating overall, that preference when it comes to ESPN. So basically, he even knows a little bit that he's pretty much just like old media. He's just turned inside out. It just is what it is.
Intend to do with this subject and everything that I touch for the end of the year is on. So my thing is this: some old media, they're gonna say like, oh, but Devin Haney, he just beat George Kambosos, right? He just beat George Kambosos. That doesn't mean that much. But this was the same fight.
Well, in my opinion, it means a decent amount, but let's not sit here and act like George Kambosos, like he was someone overall like a Mike Tyson. No one took a look at George Kambosos and actually believed that he was going to last there for that long. And you know how I know that? Because any fighter that was potentially going to fight him next, anything from Shakur Stevenson to Teofimo Lopez in the rematch to Gervonta Tank Davis to Devin Haney to Lomachenko, no one ever thought that George Kambosos was ever going to hold on to those belts, including Ego and Dante's Boxing Nation. Now, once again, does that, in my opinion, give overall an excuse to not put Devin Haney on the list? No, in my opinion, he should be on the list because George Kambosos would have at least been within my top 15 to top 20. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to it. George Kambosos, in my view, was not an A+ champion. I would say maybe he was A minus, but he was not any higher than that.
Osos, who beat Teofimo, who beat Lomachenko. Beyond that, Lomachenko was trying to fight George Kambosos Jr. So once again, you see, if you have the complexion for the protection, so you mean to tell me Lomachenko can fight Kambosos Jr. and it's a great fight, and Lomachenko as well said he was bobbing.
Well, I understand overall what you're saying there, but you guys were pulling up basically the same shit. Because Dante's Boxing Nation and Ego, they basically state that they don't want to see fights like Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk, or they don't want to see certain fights like Vasyl Lomachenko and George Kambosos. Those aren't good fights. But as soon as it's going to be for a black American fighter, oh, they're head over heels for it. So once again, I don't have a problem with some of the points that Mr. Ego is bringing up, but he's full of shit at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, all he is exactly like the media that he tries to criticize. He's just the opposite way. He's just doing it for a different complexion.
Said the fight was done. Lomachenko said he was willing to go to Australia. So once again, I have a hard time believing that tables turn if Lomachenko actually went through with it and fought Kambosos in Australia and beat him, that he wouldn't be getting praised like the best thing since sliced bread.
I would somewhat agree with that statement.
If he beat George Kambosos,
but let's be real, Mr. Ego, you do the same thing for your black American fighters, or the fighters that you prefer. When it comes to Canelo Alvarez, allegedly he's facing these weak white European fighters. But then when it comes to Gervonta Tank Davis, if you were to fight similar level competition, you would say all in all that people are hating on him and they're pocket watching all this bullshit. Even though Gervonta Tank Davis, he's fought 5 bums in a row. But it just is what it is, or at least about those, that many. So we all know that you're full of shit as well. It just is what it is.
Australia and reclaim those titles that he once had, right? But when Devin Haney does it, this is what old media does. They try to play these games and minimize the effort and act like he didn't really do anything. And we know Lomachenko's team.
Well, I understand that, Mr. Ego, but you play a lot of the same bullshit games. So let's not sit here and act like you're over high and mighty over old media. All you are is old media 2.0. That's all you are. Or I shouldn't say that. All you are is new media. All new media is basically is old media. Basically overall, just if they were the black American version, that's pretty much all they are. That's all they are. Okay? It is what it is.
When they had the same problems like the Cutman and Bill Haney and stuff, where they couldn't be a part of Lomachenko's team, all the games and charades that really didn't even work out for George Kambosos. So to me,
Well, I could have told you that I wasn't going to work out for George Kambosos because he's not an elite champion. He's a very decent fighter, but he's not an elite champion. And I was right on the money with that overall with George Kambosos, because I know a great fighter when I see one. George Kambosos is not an all-time great fighter. He's a decently great fighter, but he's not a great fighter. And in my opinion, if he were to face any one of the elite guys at 135, he would not win against them. I think the only reason, in my view, and I've already stated this multiple times, the only reason why he ever beat Teofimo Lopez in the first place was because Teofimo heavily underestimated him. Not only that, but they were very much mirrors of each other in terms of stylistically. So it gave Teofimo Lopez overall a very tough matchup, because I think that he was smelling in his own fumes a little bit too much, and his head got a little bit too big for his own britches.
Deplorable, despicable, very reprehensible that you have an undisputed champion, multiple undisputed champions in boxing right now, from Canelo to Jermell Charlo to Devin Haney. And it was a struggle. It was never a struggle to put Canelo on the pound for pound list, but it took forever to get Jermell Charlo recognized. And ESPN, I don't even know.
Right, but come on, Canelo Alvarez and Jermell Charlo, you really cannot even compare their resumes. Like that win that Canelo Alvarez even has in his career, last fight against Caleb Plant. Now, of course, he ended up losing his last fight against Dimitri Bivol, but the last victory in his career against Caleb Plant, you could debate that that's a bigger win overall in Canelo's career than any of the wins in Jermell Charlo's career, or at least on the same level as Castano. Now, of course, Castano, however you pronounce his name, when it comes down to it, the fighter from Argentina, he was a very decent fighter. He wasn't a great fighter for that division. But in my opinion, a fighter is mainly based on usually in my view, how well you would do within a multitude of weight divisions, or how decently skilled you are. Now, Castano, in my opinion, was an A- fighter. So was Caleb Plant. But when you talk about the other fighters on Canelo Alvarez's resume as well, he has so many A-grade fighters on there. Like, he has Arasani Lara, Gennady Golovkin, Danny Jacobs, Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith, Sergey Kovalev, even though he was a little bit more wore down. He has overall, I believe, Austin Trout when he was undefeated. Miguel Cotto, one of the best technicians that I've personally ever seen, in his revival. So we have to give Canelo Alvarez a lot of credit. Like, that's another thing why I like to review these channels, because these guys never put anything into context. Like, if you really try to compare Jermell Charlo and Canelo Alvarez in an intelligent way, it just doesn't work, because overall Jermell Charlo's resume doesn't even compare. It's not even close.
They put him.
In my view, Jermell Charlo doesn't even have the resume of a Terrence Bud Crawford, and that's stating something.
On the top 10 yet. And you see the big box media, they keep leaving and disrespecting Devin Haney. But when Canelo fights the guys he fights to become undisputed at 168, which was a pretty flat division, because he didn't.
No, it wasn't a flat division. In fact, you were stating even before the fight that you thought that Caleb Plant overall had a very decent chance. So stop bullshitting, Ego. That's another thing that annoys me so much about these channels. These guys always go back on their word. Once again, and that's how you can tell, what a fanboy is, and what a hater is, because they will always change the narrative depending on what happens. They're never consistent.
Fight David Benavidez, which would have probably been his toughest fight. He gets praised for it. But Devin Haney travels across seas and beats up on Kambosos, who had just come off his biggest win with Teofimo, and he's undefeated.
Right, but in my view, George Kambosos, he was not the fighter of what a Caleb Plant was. And listen, a lot of people are going to disagree with that. Caleb Plant, in my opinion, for 168, was at one point in time looked at as the best overall fighter at 168, even with David Benavidez being in that division. You had certain fighters out here, or certain fighters, certain channels like Aki TV and Dante's Boxing Nation and Champside that once upon a time said that Caleb Plant was a very dangerous fighter, and that allegedly Canelo Alvarez was avoiding him. And then a couple years later, Canelo Alvarez fights him, and what do they say? Oh, well, he's just facing another weak European fighter. So that's how you know the difference between a hater, because they're never satisfied.
And he doesn't get recognition from Ring Magazine and some other boxing media. I mean, this is unbelievable stuff. Let me know how I did in this video. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. SLC, subscribe, like, and comment. And I'm out.
But anyways, that's really overall about it for this video. I just thought that would be very particularly interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for today. I just thought that I would explain that because overall there was a commentator in my last video, and he gave me an idea for another video that I thought would be very particularly interesting that I could commentate on. But anyways, thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.